The folder slipped from my hands the moment I stood up too fast, and papers scattered across the marble floor of the office. I bent down quickly, biting back a gasp as pain shot up my leg. I had hoped no one would notice. I was wrong. Adrian Castellano was standing by the window, phone in one hand, watching the city below. He turned the instant I dropped the folder, and his eyes moved to me before they moved to the papers. I felt his gaze settle on the way I limped forward, favoring my right leg, trying to make the movement look natural. It wasn't natural. Nothing about the last few months had been natural. "Leave it," he said. His voice was calm, low, the kind of calm that made people in this building stop breathing for a second. "Grace will pick it up." I straightened, forcing a smile onto my face. "It's fine, Mr. Castellano. I've got it." He didn't answer right away. He simply watched me kneel again, slower this time, careful not to let my skirt shift and reveal the bruise that had bloomed dark purple across my thigh the night before. I gathered the papers, stacked them, and stood, keeping my chin up the way I always did when I wanted people to think everything in my life was under control. Adrian was still watching me, not the papers, me. "Alina," he said, and the sound of my name in his mouth always did something strange to my chest, something I refused to examine too closely. "How long have you worked for me?" 14 months, I answered immediately. 14 months, he repeated, as if testing the number. "And in 14 months, you have never once been late. You have never once missed a meeting, misplaced a file, or given me a reason to raise my voice." He set his phone down on the glass desk, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "This morning you were 9 minutes late. You winced when you sat down. And just now, you moved like every step cost you something." My stomach tightened. I had known men like Adrian my whole life, men who ran empires built on fear and control, men who noticed everything because their survival depended on noticing everything. I had told myself, foolishly, that I was different, that I was just the secretary, invisible enough to slip past his radar. I understood now how wrong I had been. "I twisted my ankle," I said, "on the stairs. It's nothing." His dark eyes held mine for a long moment, and I felt the lie sitting heavy and obvious between us. Adrian Castellano did not believe in coincidences, and he certainly did not believe in careless excuses, but he let it go, at least for now, with a slow nod that told me he was filing the information away rather than accepting it. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We have the shipment schedule to review." I sat, grateful for the shift in subject, and pulled my laptop toward me with hands that were not quite steady. For the next hour, we worked through numbers and routes and names I had long since learned not to ask questions about. Adrian's world was one of careful arrangements, of men who spoke in code and warehouses that held more than they appeared to. I had taken this job because it paid more than anything else I had ever been offered, because my previous life had left me with debts I could not climb out of any other way. I told myself I was just doing paperwork. I told myself a lot of things. Working for a man like Adrian meant learning to read a room before you learned to read the reports on your desk. It meant understanding when silence was safer than speech, and when a raised eyebrow from him could end someone's career, or worse. But it also meant something I hadn't expected when I started this job. It meant safety, of a kind, within these walls. No one dared raise a hand or a voice against me here. No one would dream of it. Outside these walls was a different story entirely. My phone buzzed against the desk, and I turned it over instinctively before the screen could light up where Adrian might see it. 2 words from Daniel, my fiancé. "Where are you?" No question mark. Daniel never used question marks anymore. Statements didn't ask for permission the way questions did, and somewhere over the past year, Daniel had stopped asking for anything. He simply expected. I typed back quickly, saying I was at work and would be home by 6, and slid the phone face down again, but not quickly enough. "Everything all right?" Adrian asked, not looking up from the document in front of him, though I had learned that Adrian rarely missed anything, even when his eyes appeared occupied elsewhere. "Fine," I said, "just my fiancé checking in." Something shifted in the air of the room, subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Adrian's pen paused over the page for half a second, before continuing its steady movement. "Daniel," he said. Not a question. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. He had access to background checks on everyone who came within 10 feet of his organization, including the people his employees chose to marry. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice light. "We're getting married in the spring." "Congratulations," Adrian said, and though the word was polite, there was something underneath it that I couldn't quite identify. Not warmth, not quite suspicion either, something more careful than both. We finished the shipment review, and I gathered my things to return to my own desk outside his office, grateful for a moment away from his attention. My leg throbbed with every step, a steady reminder of the argument 2 nights before, of Daniel's hand closing around my arm hard enough to bruise, of the moment I had stumbled against the kitchen counter and struck my thigh on the edge of the drawer. I had told myself it was an accident. I had told myself that for months now, about many things. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm, calls to return, meetings to schedule, a courier who arrived with a package that made 2 of Adrian's men go very quiet and very alert until they confirmed its contents. I had learned not to ask about packages like that. I had learned a great many things in 14 months that I would never be able to unlearn. Around 4 in the afternoon, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the conference room and paused. I looked tired. Not just physically tired, though the ache in my legs certainly contributed to that, but tired in a deeper way, the kind of exhaustion that came from years of holding your breath, waiting for the next outburst, the next slammed door, the next apology that never quite felt like enough to make up for what came before it. I hadn't always been like this. 3 years ago, before Daniel, I had been someone who laughed easily and trusted people without hesitation. I tried to remember what that felt like sometimes. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, but the memory felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. At 5:30, Adrian's office door opened, and he stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. He paused at my desk, and I looked up, expecting instructions for tomorrow's schedule. "Stay for a few minutes after everyone leaves," he said quietly. "I want to talk to you about something." My pulse quickened, though I couldn't say exactly why. "Of course, Mr. Castellano. Is there a problem with the schedule?" "No," he said. "Nothing like that." He returned to his office, and I sat at my desk trying to focus on the emails in front of me while my mind raced through possibilities. Had I made a mistake somewhere? Had he found some error in the paperwork? Or was this about what he had noticed this morning? The limp, the wince, the lie about the stairs. The other staff filtered out over the next half hour, calling their good nights, until the office fell into the particular silence that only existed after hours in a building this large, a silence that felt both peaceful and slightly unnerving. I remained at my desk, checking my phone once to see another message from Daniel, reminding me that I had said 6 and it was almost 6:30. I typed back an apology, my thumbs moving quickly, explaining that Adrian had asked me to stay late for work reasons, that I would be home as soon as possible. I hit send and immediately regretted the surge of anxiety that settled into my chest as I waited for his reply. It came a minute later, a single word. "Fine." Just that. One word that somehow carried the weight of an entire argument waiting to happen the moment I walked through our front door. I placed the phone in my bag and stood, smoothing down my skirt, trying to compose myself before stepping into Adrian's office. He was standing by the window again when I entered, city lights beginning to flicker on below as the sun dipped lower behind the buildings. He didn't turn immediately, and for a moment, I simply stood there, watching him, wondering not for the first time what exactly went on behind that composed, unreadable exterior. "Close the door," he said. I did, my hand lingering on the handle a second longer than necessary, some instinct telling me that whatever conversation was about to happen, it would change something between us. I couldn't have known then just how right that instinct was. Adrian finally turned to face me, and in the low evening light his expression looked different than I had ever seen it, softer somehow, though his eyes held the same sharp intelligence they always did. "Sit down, Alina," he said. "I think it's time we talked honestly about what I saw this morning." I lowered myself into the chair across from his desk, my heart hammering against my ribs, uncertain whether I was more afraid of what he might ask or of what I might accidentally reveal. The office felt smaller than it had all day, the walls closer, the silence heavier. Adrian remained standing, studying me with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I've built my entire life on paying attention to details other people miss," he said slowly. "It's kept me alive more times than I can count. And for the last few months, I've noticed things about you that concern me." My mouth went dry. "Mr. Castellano, I appreciate your concern. But truly, everything is fine." "You've said that 3 times today," he said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that left no room for further deflection. "I don't believe you, Alina, and I think somewhere underneath the fear I can see in your eyes right now, you know that I don't believe you." I opened my mouth to protest again, but the words caught in my throat. Something about the way he looked at me, patient and unwavering, made the careful walls I had built over the past year feel suddenly fragile, as though one more push might bring the entire structure crashing down. I hadn't told anyone the truth, not my sister, who lived 3 states away and called every Sunday without fail. Not my closest friend from college, who had asked more than once why I seemed distant lately. I hadn't told a single person the truth about what my life at home had become. And yet here I sat, in the office of a man the entire city feared, feeling more exposed than I had in months. "It's complicated," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It usually is," Adrian said. He moved from the window and sat on the edge of his desk, closer to me now, though still maintaining a careful distance that somehow made the moment feel safer rather than threatening. "But complicated things have a way of becoming simple once someone finally says them out loud." I stared down at my hands folded in my lap, at the small bruise still faintly visible on my wrist, beneath the sleeve of my blouse, if the light hit it just right. I thought about Daniel waiting at home, about the message still sitting on my phone, one word carrying the promise of another difficult night. I thought about how tired I was, how completely exhausted from carrying this weight alone for so long. "I fell," I said quietly, "a lot more than I let on." Adrian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. "Alina, please," I said, looking up at him, my eyes suddenly burning with tears I refused to let fall in front of him. "Please don't ask me anything else right now. I can't. Not tonight." He studied me for a long moment, and I watched something pass behind his eyes, something that looked dangerously close to controlled anger, though his voice remained gentle when he finally spoke. "All right," he said, "not tonight. But this conversation isn't over, Alina. I want you to understand that clearly." I nodded, unable to trust my own voice, and gathered my bag from where I had set it beside the chair. As I stood to leave, Adrian said one more thing that I would carry with me through the sleepless hours that followed. "Whatever is happening to you," he said quietly, "it ends. I promise you that." I left the office without responding, my legs unsteady beneath me, uncertain whether his words had frightened me or offered the first real comfort I had felt in longer than I could remember. As I stepped out into the cool evening air and made my way toward the train station, I had no idea that somewhere across the street, in the shadow of a parked car, someone was watching me leave the building, taking note of exactly how long I had stayed and exactly who I had stayed with. Daniel was already home when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with his jacket still on, a glass of something amber-colored in front of him. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinctive calculation every person in my situation learns to make without even realizing it. What kind of mood, what kind of night, what kind of version of him would greet me tonight? "You're late," he said, not looking up from his glass. "I told you. Adrian asked me to stay after everyone left. There was something he needed to discuss." I set my bag down carefully on the counter, keeping my movements slow and unhurried, the way you might approach an animal you weren't entirely sure was calm. "Adrian," Daniel repeated, finally lifting his eyes to mine. "You call your boss by his first name now?" "Everyone does. It's just how the office works." I moved toward the refrigerator, needing something to do with my hands, needing the small illusion of normalcy that came with the mundane act of pouring myself a glass of water. "Must be nice," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge I recognized too well. "Working for a man who can buy this entire building without blinking, while I'm stuck driving deliveries for people who don't even know my name. I said nothing. I had learned, over the past year, that silence was often the safest response, though it rarely stopped him from continuing. "What did he want to talk to you about?" Daniel asked. "This Adrian of yours." My mind raced back to the office, to Adrian's steady gaze, and the promise he had made just before I left. "Whatever is happening to you, it ends." I couldn't tell Daniel that. I couldn't tell him that my employer had noticed the bruises, had noticed the limp, had started asking questions I had spent months carefully avoiding. "Just work things," I said. "Nothing important." Daniel stood from the table, and I watched the way he moved, the careful deliberateness of someone who had been drinking enough to feel bold, but not enough to lose full control of his actions. He crossed the kitchen and stood closer to me than I wanted, close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You know," he said, "you've been different lately. Distant, like your mind is somewhere else." His hand came up, and I forced myself not to flinch as his fingers brushed a strand of hair back from my face, the gesture almost tender, if I hadn't known better than to trust it. "Is there something you're not telling me, Alina?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." He studied my face for a long moment, and I held perfectly still, the way I had learned to hold still through countless similar moments over the past year, waiting to see which direction the conversation would turn. Finally, he stepped back, and some of the tension in my shoulders eased, though not entirely. "I made reservations for Friday," he said, returning to the table and his glass. "For the venue, we need to finalize the deposit. The wedding." I had almost forgotten, in the haze of the day's events, that we were still supposed to be planning a wedding, still supposed to be two people building a future together, rather than two strangers circling each other in careful, practiced patterns of avoidance and appeasement. "Okay," I said, "Friday works." I spent the rest of the evening in careful, quiet movements, preparing dinner, cleaning the kitchen, retreating to the bedroom earlier than usual under the pretense of exhaustion. Daniel didn't follow immediately, and I lay in the dark listening to the sound of the television from the living room, my mind circling back again and again to Adrian's office, to the way he had looked at me, to the promise that had settled into my chest like something both frightening and impossibly comforting. I didn't sleep well that night. I rarely did anymore. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, partly out of habit, and partly because staying home longer than necessary had become something I actively avoided whenever possible. Adrian was already there when I walked in, standing near the reception area speaking quietly with one of his men, a tall figure named Marco, who had worked for Adrian longer than I had been employed there. Their conversation stopped the moment they noticed me, and Marco nodded once before disappearing down the hallway toward the private offices. "Good morning," Adrian said, his eyes moving over me with the same careful attention as the day before, though I noticed he was checking for something specific this time, some sign of whether the previous night had brought new harm. "Good morning, Mr. Castellano," I said, settling behind my desk and pulling up the day's schedule on my computer. "You look tired," he observed. "I didn't sleep well," I admitted, before I could stop myself. It was such a small admission, but it felt significant somehow, a crack in the careful composure I had maintained for so long. Adrian didn't push further, not immediately, but he lingered near my desk longer than his usual morning greeting typically required. "There's a meeting at 10 with the shipping contractors. I'd like you in the room for this one, taking detailed notes. It's important." I nodded, grateful for the shift toward business, toward the familiar rhythm of tasks and responsibilities that required nothing of me beyond competence and attention. The morning passed in its usual fashion, calls and emails, and the quiet hum of an office that ran with the precision of a machine built by someone who tolerated no inefficiency. The meeting with the shipping contractors proved tense from the start. Two men I hadn't seen before sat across the conference table from Adrian, their body language rigid, their voices carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained frustration. I sat slightly behind Adrian's right shoulder, my laptop open, transcribing the conversation as instructed, while trying to make sense of a discussion filled with references I didn't fully understand, delayed shipments, and missing containers and consequences that hung unspoken in the air whenever certain names came up. At one point, one of the contractors raised his voice, leaning forward across the table with an aggressive posture that made my pulse quicken instinctively, my body reacting before my mind could remind me that I wasn't the target of his anger. Adrian's response was immediate and cold, a single sentence delivered in a tone so quiet and so absolute that the contractor sat back immediately, his aggression deflating like air escaping a punctured tire. I had seen glimpses of this side of Adrian before, the side that made his reputation what it was, but something about witnessing it up close, watching the way an entire room could shift at the sound of his voice, left me with a complicated feeling I didn't fully understand. Fear, certainly, the same fear that anyone with sense would feel in the presence of a man capable of commanding such absolute deference. But underneath that fear, something else, something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. This was a man who did not tolerate people raising their voices or their hands against those weaker than themselves. I had spent so long living with the opposite that the contrast felt almost dizzying. The meeting concluded an hour later, the contractors leaving with promises to correct whatever failures had prompted the discussion, their earlier bravado entirely gone. Adrian remained seated at the table after they left, and I began gathering my things, expecting to be dismissed back to my desk. "Alina," he said, and I paused, looking up. "Sit for a moment." I lowered myself back into my chair, uncertain what was coming, though a part of me suspected this conversation had been waiting since the previous evening, simply delayed by the demands of the workday. "I meant what I said last night," Adrian began, his voice quieter now than it had been during the meeting, though no less firm. "I don't like guessing at things, Alina, and I especially don't like watching someone I respect suffer in silence when I have the ability to do something about it." "Mr. Castellano," I started, but he raised a hand slightly, not sharply, just enough to ask for the space to finish his thought. "I've had people watching your building for the past week," he said, and my stomach dropped at the admission, a mixture of alarm and something else entirely, something almost like gratitude that felt shameful given the circumstances. "I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I said anything to you directly. I know about the arguments. I know your neighbors have heard raised voices more nights than not over the last several months." I felt heat rise in my face, humiliation flooding through me at the realization that my private struggles had become visible enough for others to notice and report. "You had someone watching me?" "I had someone watching out for you," Adrian corrected, his tone even but firm. "There's a difference, though I understand it might not feel that way right now." I stared at him, a thousand emotions tangling together in my chest, anger at the invasion of privacy warring with a desperate, aching relief that someone finally knew, that I no longer had to carry the full weight of this secret entirely alone. "Why do you care?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "I'm just your secretary." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like pain, quickly masked beneath his usual composure. "You're not just anything, Alina," he said quietly. "You're one of the few people in my life who has never once tried to manipulate me, never once asked me for anything beyond a fair wage for honest work. In my world, that makes you rare. It makes you someone worth protecting." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, my eyes falling to my hands folded tightly in my lap. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with things unspoken, until Adrian finally continued. "I'm not going to force you to tell me anything you're not ready to share," he said. "But I want you to know that whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I will help you. Whether that means finding you somewhere else to live, ending your engagement quietly and legally, or something more permanent, the choice will always be yours. I will simply make sure you have options." The word permanent hung in the air between us, and though he hadn't elaborated, I understood the weight behind it, understood exactly what kind of resources and connections a man like Adrian possessed. The kind that could make problems disappear entirely if he decided they needed to. The realization sent a chill through me, not entirely unpleasant, a strange mixture of unease and the dark, guilty comfort of knowing that someone powerful stood ready to intervene on my behalf. "I need to think," I said finally. "This is a lot to process." "Take all the time you need," Adrian said. "But Alina, don't wait too long. Situations like yours rarely improve on their own. They tend to escalate." I left his office that afternoon feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted in some fundamental way, as though a door I hadn't even realized existed had suddenly cracked open, revealing possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something that might have been hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. That evening, driving home on the train, I found myself replaying every word of the conversation, turning Adrian's promise over in my mind, like a stone I couldn't stop touching. I thought about the future stretching out before me, one path leading toward Friday's wedding venue deposit, toward a lifetime bound to Daniel, and the careful, exhausting calculations that came with loving someone who frightened you more often than he comforted you. The other path remained undefined, uncertain, but it carried within it the first real possibility of freedom I had felt in years. When I arrived home, Daniel was waiting again, this time with a bouquet of flowers on the table, an apology, I realized, for whatever tension had lingered from the previous night. He smiled when I walked in, and for a moment, the old familiar warmth I had once felt for him flickered somewhere in my chest, a reminder of who he had been before the drinking became heavier, before his temper became something I had to navigate rather than simply enjoy. "I know I've been difficult lately," he said, crossing the room to wrap his arms around me. "Work has been stressful. I don't mean to take it out on you." I let him hold me, my body stiff at first, before gradually relaxing into the familiar shape of his embrace. And for a moment, I allowed myself to believe, the way I had allowed myself to believe so many times before, that this time, things might actually be different. That the version of Daniel standing in our kitchen with flowers and apologies was the true version, and the other, darker version was simply an aberration, something that could be fixed with enough patience and understanding. But even as I stood there in his arms, some quieter, more honest part of me knew better. I had believed this same story too many times to count, and every single time, the peace never lasted more than a few days before the cycle began again. Later that night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my phone resting on my chest, Adrian's words echoing through my mind. "I will simply make sure you have options." I thought about the bruises hidden beneath my clothes, about the careful lies I told coworkers and friends and family, about the wedding venue deposit due in 3 days that would tie me more permanently to a life I was no longer certain I wanted. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, I quietly slipped out of bed and made my way to the bathroom, locking the door behind me out of habit rather than necessity. I sat on the edge of the tub and finally allowed myself to cry, silent tears that had been building for months, maybe years, releasing something inside me that I hadn't realized was so tightly wound. When I finally returned to bed, exhausted but strangely lighter, I made a decision, quiet and private, that I wasn't yet ready to voice aloud even to myself. Tomorrow, I would talk to Adrian. Tomorrow, I would tell him everything. I had no way of knowing, as I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that events were already being set into motion that would make that conversation unnecessary. That somewhere in the city, decisions were being made about Daniel that had nothing to do with anything I would say or do, and that by the time the sun rose again, my life would already be irreversibly changed. The kitchen light flickered once when I walked in, and Daniel was already standing there waiting, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable in a way that immediately set every nerve in my body on alert. Something was different tonight. Not the usual irritation over lateness or a forgotten errand, but something colder, more calculated, as though he had spent the entire day building toward this exact moment. "Sit down," he said. "Daniel, I just got home. Let me at least put my bag down." "Sit down, Alina." I recognized the tone. I had learned to recognize every version of his voice over the past year, the way a sailor learns to read the changing color of the sea before a storm arrives. This tone meant something had shifted, something had been discovered or decided, and no amount of careful movement on my part would prevent whatever was coming. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, my bag still clutched in my lap like a shield that offered no actual protection. Daniel remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the window, his shadow stretching long across the kitchen floor in the dim evening light. "I got a call today," he said, From someone I used to work with. He told me an interesting story about a black car that's been parked outside our building for the last week. Said it belongs to Castellano's people. My blood went cold. I kept my face as neutral as I could manage, though I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten involuntarily. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't, Daniel said sharply, turning to face me fully now. Don't sit there and lie to my face. You think I'm stupid? You think I haven't noticed how different you've been, how you flinch every time your phone buzzes, how you've started staying later and later at that office? His voice rose with each sentence, the calm calculation of a moment ago, giving way to the familiar heat of his temper. Did you tell him? Did you tell your boss what happens in this house? Daniel, please, keep your voice down. Answer me. His fist came down on the table hard enough to make the salt shaker jump, and I flinched despite myself, my heart hammering against my ribs. Did you tell that man about us? I stared at him, my mind racing through possible responses, each one carrying its own risk, its own potential to either calm the situation or ignite it further. He noticed I was hurt, I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't have to. He's not stupid either. Daniel's face contorted with something between fury and disbelief. So now the entire Castellano organization knows my business. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what kind of man that is? He could have me disappeared without anyone ever finding a trace, and you just handed him the reason to do it. He's not going to hurt you, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely certain they were true. I thought about Adrian's careful promise from the previous evening, the word permanent hanging unspoken between us, and a chill crept along my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. You don't know that, Daniel snapped. You don't know anything about men like him except what he lets you see in that office. Men like Adrian Castellano don't build empires by being merciful, Alina. They build them by making examples out of people who become inconvenient. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing again, his agitation filling the small kitchen like smoke. This is your fault. All of this. If you had just kept your mouth shut, none of this would be happening. I felt something shift inside me then, something that had been building for months, maybe years, a quiet reservoir of anger and exhaustion that finally found its way to the surface. My fault, I repeated, and something in my own voice surprised me, a steadiness I hadn't expected to find. Daniel, I have bruises up and down my body that I've had to hide from everyone I know for months. I've lied to my sister, to my friends, to myself, about why I keep getting hurt. And you want to stand there and tell me this is my fault? His expression flickered with something almost like surprise at my tone, quickly replaced by renewed anger. Watch how you speak to me. No, I said, and the word felt foreign in my mouth, powerful in a way I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. I am done watching how I speak to you, Daniel. I am done tiptoeing around your moods, done calculating every word before I say it, just to keep you calm. I am exhausted, and I am done. For a moment, the kitchen fell into a silence so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Daniel stared at me as though I had transformed into someone he no longer recognized, and in a way, perhaps I had. The version of me sitting at that table was not the same woman who had walked through the door 14 months ago, hopeful and naive about the life she was building with the man she loved. You're done, Daniel finally repeated, his voice dangerously quiet now, quieter than his shouting had been, and somehow more frightening for it. After everything I've given you, after everything I've sacrificed to be with you, you sit there and tell me you're done. I need air, he said abruptly, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. I need to think, and I can't do that in this house right now. He moved toward the door, and some instinct made me stand, made me follow him a few steps into the hallway, though I couldn't have said exactly what I intended to say. Daniel paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back to look at me one final time, his expression a complicated mixture of anger and something that almost looked like grief. This isn't over, he said. We're going to finish this conversation when I get back. The door closed behind him with a solid, final sound, and I stood alone in the hallway, my heart still racing, my hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. I remained there for several minutes, uncertain whether to feel relieved that the confrontation had ended or terrified about what would happen when he returned. I retreated to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling out my phone and staring at the screen without really seeing it. Part of me wanted to call Adrian, to tell him what had happened, to ask whether the black car outside our building meant what Daniel seemed to believe it meant. But another part of me hesitated, unwilling to draw him further into a situation that already felt dangerously out of my control. An hour passed, then two. I texted Daniel once, a simple message asking if he was all right, and received no response. By 10 o'clock, my initial relief at his absence had transformed into a low, persistent anxiety that gnawed at the edges of my composure. Daniel rarely stayed out this long without at least sending some acknowledgement, even if it was only to extend our argument through a series of angry messages. I called him at 11. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, his familiar recorded greeting sounding strange and distant in the quiet of our empty apartment. I tried again 15 minutes later, with the same result. By midnight, I had called 7 times, each attempt ending in the same hollow ring followed by voicemail, and the anxiety that had been building in my chest had begun to shift into something closer to genuine fear. I paced the length of our small living room, phone clutched in my hand, running through possibilities that grew increasingly alarming with each passing minute. Had he been in an accident? Had he simply gone to a bar and lost track of time, drowning his anger in alcohol the way he sometimes did? Or had something else happened entirely, something connected to the black car he had mentioned, to the organization he seemed so certain would view him as an inconvenient problem to be solved? I thought about calling Adrian then, my thumb hovering over his contact information for a long moment before I finally set the phone down, unable to bring myself to make that call, unable to voice the question that had begun to form in the darkest corner of my mind. Did you do something to him? Sleep proved impossible. I sat curled on the couch through the early hours of the morning, the television playing quietly in the background, though I absorbed none of what appeared on the screen, my attention entirely consumed by the silent phone resting on the cushion beside me. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy doze, jolting awake every 20 minutes or so, at imagined sounds, certain each time that I had heard the front door opening, only to find the apartment exactly as empty as it had been before. By 6 in the morning, sunlight beginning to creep through the curtains, I accepted that Daniel had not come home. I called his phone one final time, and this time, the call didn't even ring before going straight to voicemail, an automated message informing me that the number I was trying to reach was no longer in service. I stared at my phone, disbelief and fear tangling together in a knot so tight I could barely breathe. Numbers didn't simply stop working overnight, not unless something had happened to the phone itself, or unless someone had made a very deliberate decision to disconnect it entirely. I forced myself through the motions of getting ready for work, though every action felt disconnected from my body, as though I were watching myself move through the apartment from somewhere outside my own skin. I checked the parking area outside our building before leaving, and Daniel's car was gone, exactly as I had known it would be, though some foolish, hopeful part of me had wanted to be wrong. The train ride to the office passed in a blur, my mind cycling endlessly through scenarios I couldn't control, couldn't verify, couldn't do anything about, beyond simply waiting and hoping for some piece of information that would explain what had happened. Had he simply left, angry enough at our argument to disappear for a few days, staying with a friend, or checking into a hotel to avoid facing me? Or had something more permanent occurred, something connected to the promise Adrian had made, to the black car parked outside our apartment, to an organization that dealt with problems in ways I had never allowed myself to fully consider? I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, though the extra time did nothing to steady my nerves. Adrian was already there, as he usually was, standing near the window of his office with a cup of coffee, and the moment I stepped through the door, his eyes found mine, with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Alina," he said, setting down his coffee and moving toward me with a purposefulness that immediately put me on edge. "You look pale. Sit down." I lowered myself into the chair near his desk, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched my bag in my lap. "Daniel is gone," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, before I could carefully consider how to phrase what I needed to ask. "He left last night after we argued, and he never came back. His phone is disconnected. His car is gone. Adrian's expression remained carefully composed, though I searched his face for any flicker of reaction, any hint of guilt or knowledge that might confirm the suspicion growing steadily in my chest. "That's concerning," he said evenly. "Have you called the police?" "Not yet," I admitted. "I wanted to talk to you first." Something passed between us in that moment, an unspoken question hanging heavy in the air of his office, and I watched Adrian carefully, searching for any sign of the truth beneath his calm exterior. He held my gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying anything, simply waiting, as though giving me the space to ask the question I was too afraid to voice aloud. "Adrian," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you have anything to do with this?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, carrying none of the reassuring warmth I had come to expect from our conversations over the past 2 days. "I told you last night that I would help you," he said. "I told you I would make sure you had options. Beyond that, Alina, I think it's better for both of us if some questions remain unasked." I stared at him, the implication of his words settling over me like a weight I couldn't fully process. Fear, and something else. Something more complicated and harder to name, tangling together in my chest. I should have felt only horror at what his careful non-answer suggested. Instead, standing there in his office with the morning light filtering through the windows, I felt a strange, unsettling calm beginning to replace the panic that had consumed me through the long, sleepless night. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Adrian said, his voice softening slightly, "you file a missing persons report, exactly as anyone in your position would do. You cooperate fully with the police, and you let me handle everything else." I nodded slowly, though 1,000 questions remained unasked, hovering unspoken between us. As I turned to leave his office, Adrian said one final thing that would echo through my mind for days afterward, through the police interviews, and the careful, rehearsed answers I gave about the last time I had seen my fiancé. "Whatever you're feeling right now," he said quietly, "don't let guilt convince you that you did something wrong." You didn't. I left his office and made my way to my desk, my hands finally steady for the first time since the previous night, though I couldn't have said whether that steadiness came from relief or from something far more troubling, a quiet acceptance settling into my chest that I wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. 2 officers arrived at the apartment that evening, a woman named Karen, with tired eyes and a notepad, and a younger man named Ethan, who seemed to be taking his first missing persons case seriously enough to double-check every detail twice. I sat on the couch where I had spent the previous night waiting for a call that never came, answering their questions as steadily as I could manage. "When did you last see him?" Karen asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Around 8 last night," I said. "We argued. He said he needed air and left. I haven't heard from him since." "What was the argument about?" Ethan asked, and I felt the careful weight of the question, the way both officers watched my face for any flicker of hesitation. "Personal matters," I said. "Nothing that would explain him disappearing like this." Karen made a note, her expression giving nothing away. "Has this happened before? Him leaving after an argument and staying out?" "Sometimes," I admitted, choosing my words with the same careful precision I had learned to use with Daniel himself. "Never this long, though. Never without at least a text." They asked about his workplace, his friends, any family he might have gone to stay with. I answered each question honestly, providing names and numbers where I had them, watching as Karen filled page after page of her notepad with the small, scattered details of a life I had shared with a man who now seemed to have vanished as completely as smoke. "We'll need to check his phone records," Ethan said, "and see if his car shows up on any traffic cameras. Sometimes people just need space and turn up within a few days. And sometimes they don't," Karen added quietly, not unkindly, simply stating a fact that hung heavy in the room. "Is there anyone who might have wanted to hurt him? Any conflicts at work, debts, anything like that?" I thought of Adrian's careful, unfinished answer from that morning, of the black car Daniel had mentioned parked outside our building, of the word permanent that still echoed uncomfortably in my mind. "Not that I know of," I said, and the lie, or perhaps the omission, settled into my stomach like a stone. The officers left an hour later with promises to follow up as soon as they had information, and I sat alone in the quiet apartment long after their departure, the silence pressing in around me in a way that felt entirely different from the silence of the previous night. That silence had been filled with fear and uncertainty. This silence felt heavier, weighted with a knowledge I couldn't quite bring myself to name, even in the privacy of my own thoughts. A week passed with no word from Daniel, and the apartment I had once shared with him began to feel less like a home and more like a museum of a life I no longer recognized as mine. His clothes still hung in the closet. His toothbrush still sat in the cup by the bathroom sink. Every object carried the strange weight of belonging to someone who might return at any moment, or might never return at all, and I found myself moving through the rooms with a kind of careful avoidance, as though touching his things too directly might somehow disturb whatever fragile balance had settled over my life. At the office, everything continued with its usual precision, meetings and calls and the steady rhythm of Adrian's business, but I noticed the subtle shift in the way people around me behaved. Grace, the young woman from accounting who normally chatted with me over coffee in the break room, had grown noticeably quieter, offering polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Marco, who usually greeted me with an easy nod each morning, now seemed to find reasons to avoid direct conversation altogether, his attention conveniently occupied elsewhere whenever I passed. I told myself it was simply sympathy, the awkwardness people often felt around someone dealing with a difficult personal situation, uncertain what to say or how to say it, without causing further pain. But some quieter instinct suggested a different explanation entirely, one I wasn't yet ready to confront directly. They knew something, or they suspected something, and their careful distance felt less like sympathy and more like the particular caution people extend towards someone connected, however distantly, to matters they would rather not understand too clearly. Adrian himself had grown more attentive over the past week, though his attention manifested in small, careful ways rather than any dramatic gesture. He asked after my well-being each morning, with a sincerity that felt different from simple politeness. He assigned me lighter workloads on days when I arrived looking particularly exhausted, without ever commenting directly on the reason. And twice now, I had noticed the same black car parked across from my building in the evenings, its presence no longer a source of confusion, but rather a strange, complicated comfort, a silent assurance that whatever else remained uncertain in my life, I was not entirely alone. On Wednesday, Grace finally broke the careful silence that had grown between us over the past week, catching me alone in the break room while I waited for the coffee machine to finish its slow, gurgling cycle. She glanced toward the doorway before speaking, her voice dropped low, almost conspiratorial. "Can I ask you something?" she said, "and you don't have to answer if you don't want to." "Of course," I said, though a knot of tension had already begun forming in my stomach. "Are you doing okay? With everything going on?" Grace's eyes carried a genuine concern that eased some of my earlier suspicion about her recent distance. "I know it's not really my place, but everyone's noticed you've been different lately, and no one really knows what to say to you, so we've all just sort of gone quiet, which probably makes things worse, not better." I felt a rush of relief at her honesty, grateful for an explanation that didn't carry the darker implications I had allowed myself to imagine over the past several days. "I appreciate you asking," I said. "It's been a difficult couple of weeks, but I'm managing." "Mr. Castellano seems different too," Grace added quietly, glancing again toward the doorway. "More protective of you than usual, if that makes sense. Marco mentioned something to me the other day, just that we should all make sure you're comfortable, that nothing bothers you while you're going through this. I didn't think much of it until I noticed the way he watches the door whenever you're running late." I absorbed her words carefully, uncertain how much of the organization's careful protectiveness had become visible to the rest of the staff, and how much remained hidden beneath the surface of ordinary office courtesy. "He's been very supportive," I said simply, and Grace nodded, apparently satisfied with the vague reassurance, before the coffee machine finished its cycle and our conversation drifted naturally back toward the ordinary rhythms of the workday. The exchange stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon, a small reminder that whatever quiet arrangement existed between Adrian and myself, however carefully guarded, had not gone entirely unnoticed by the people around us. I wondered, not for the first time, How many of Adrian's employees understood exactly what kind of organization they worked for, and how many chose deliberate ignorance as a means of sleeping soundly at night? On Thursday afternoon, nearly 10 days after Daniel's disappearance, Detective Karen called to update me on the investigation, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering information she knew would bring little satisfaction. They had found his car, abandoned in a parking structure across town, wiped clean of any useful evidence, no fingerprints, no indication of struggle, nothing to suggest where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. His bank accounts remained untouched, his phone still disconnected, every trace of his existence simply ceasing at the moment he had walked out our apartment door. "We're treating this as an active investigation," Karen said, "but I have to be honest with you, Alina. Cases like this, where someone disappears this completely, with no financial activity and no communication, they don't usually end with the person turning up safe." I thanked her for the update and ended the call, sitting alone at my desk in the quiet aftermath of her words, waiting to feel something, grief perhaps, or renewed fear, or even the guilt that Adrian had cautioned me against allowing to take root. Instead, I felt only a strange, hollow numbness, as though some essential part of me had already accepted an outcome my conscious mind refused to fully articulate. That evening, Adrian asked me to stay late again, and this time, I felt none of the anxious uncertainty that had accompanied his similar request 2 weeks earlier. I followed him into his office and closed the door behind me without being asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with a familiarity that surprised even myself. "The detective called today," I said, before he could speak first. "They found his car. Nothing else." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral in the way I had come to recognize as deliberate, a mask he wore whenever a conversation approached territory he had no intention of navigating carelessly. "How are you handling the news?" "Honestly," I said, "I don't know. I keep waiting to feel something that makes sense, grief or panic or something, and instead, I just feel tired. Tired in a way that sleep doesn't seem to fix." "That's not unusual," Adrian said. "Grief doesn't always announce itself the way people expect. Sometimes it takes its time arriving. Sometimes it never arrives at all, because what you're grieving wasn't really the person, but the idea of who you thought they were." I studied him carefully, searching his face for something beyond the careful composure he maintained so consistently. "Adrian," I said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me this time, not just give me another careful non-answer." He remained silent, watching me with an intensity that made the air in the room feel charged, waiting for the question he clearly anticipated. "Is Daniel dead?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder whether he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the evasive carefulness from our previous conversation, only a quiet, direct honesty that somehow felt more unsettling than any elaborate denial could have been. "Yes," he said simply. I felt the word land in my chest like something physical, and I waited, almost clinically, to see what emotion might follow in its wake. Horror, perhaps, or the visceral shock of confirmation after days of careful uncertainty. Instead, I found only a strange, quiet stillness settling over me, the same numbness that had accompanied Karen's earlier phone call, now deepening into something that felt disturbingly close to peace. "Did you do it?" I asked. "Or did you have it done? Does the distinction matter to you?" Adrian asked, his eyes never leaving mine. I considered the question honestly, searching within myself for the horror I felt I should be experiencing, the moral revulsion any reasonable person would feel upon learning that someone had orchestrated the death of another human being on their behalf. But when I searched for that horror, I found instead only the memory of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of nights spent flinching at the sound of a key turning in the lock, of years slowly eroded by a fear so constant it had become simply the background noise of my existence. "No," I finally said, "I don't think it does." Adrian studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful expression, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened considerably. "I want you to understand something, Alina. I didn't do this because I saw an opportunity, or because I wanted something from you in return. I did this because I watched a man cause you harm for months, and I have never once, in my entire life, been able to stand by and watch someone I care about suffer without acting. The word care hung between us, quiet but unmistakable, and I felt something shift within my own chest in response, a recognition of feelings I had been carefully avoiding examining too closely over the past several weeks. "How did it happen?" I asked, though some part of me wondered whether I truly wanted the answer. "That's not something you need to carry," Adrian said gently. "What matters is that it's finished, and that you're safe now, completely and permanently safe, in a way you haven't been in a very long time." I sat quietly, absorbing the weight of everything he had just confirmed, the reality of what his careful, unspoken promises had ultimately meant. Somewhere in the city, or perhaps far beyond it, Daniel's body existed in some state I would never fully know the details of, the man who had once promised to spend his life loving and protecting me, instead having spent his final months teaching me the particular, exhausting arithmetic of survival. "I should feel worse about this," I admitted quietly. "I should feel like a terrible person for not feeling worse." "You're not a terrible person," Adrian said firmly. "You're someone who survived something no one should have to survive, and now that survival is finally, completely, behind you. Don't let guilt convince you otherwise." We sat in silence for a while longer, the office growing darker as evening settled fully over the city outside the windows, until finally, Adrian rose from his desk and moved to sit in the chair beside mine, rather than across from it, closing the careful professional distance that had always existed between us. "I need you to know something else," he said. "None of this changes how I feel about you. Or rather, it doesn't change anything except perhaps making it more difficult for me to continue pretending that what I feel is simply professional concern." I turned to look at him fully, my heart beginning to beat with a different kind of intensity than the fear and grief that had consumed the past several weeks. "Adrian, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything from you right now, especially not this soon after everything you've been through. I simply wanted you to understand where things stand between us, so that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, you know exactly what I'm offering." I looked at him for a long moment, at the careful, unwavering steadiness that had characterized every interaction between us since the very beginning of my employment, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tightly wound for longer than I could accurately remember. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for everything. Even the parts I probably shouldn't be thanking you for." A faint smile touched the corner of Adrian's mouth, the first genuine smile I had seen from him in the weeks since Daniel's disappearance. "You're welcome, Alina. Now go home and rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest, together, whatever that ends up looking like." I left his office that evening with a complicated mixture of emotions swirling through me, grief and relief and guilt, and something warmer that I wasn't yet ready to name directly, but beneath all of it, a foundation of calm I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Whatever judgment history might eventually pass on the choices that had led me to this moment, I understood clearly, walking out into the cool evening air, that I was finally, truly safe, and that the man responsible for that safety was waiting patiently, without pressure or expectation, for whatever came next between us. The black car followed at a careful distance as I walked toward the train station, its presence no longer strange or unsettling, but simply a quiet fact of my new existence, a reminder that eyes I trusted were watching over the path between my workplace and my home. I thought about the apartment waiting for me, still filled with Daniel's belongings, still carrying the particular silence of a life interrupted mid-sentence, and I made a decision as I climbed the station steps that I would begin, this weekend, the slow process of clearing away what remained, not out of anger, and not entirely out of grief either, but out of a simple, necessary desire to finally make room for whatever came next. The train arrived a few minutes later, and I settled into a seat near the window, watching the city lights blur past in the darkness, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, something that resembled the quiet, unremarkable comfort of an ordinary evening. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new conversations with Adrian about what our future might hold, new decisions about the apartment and the wedding venue deposit I would now need to cancel, and the careful, complicated grief of mourning a relationship that had died long before Daniel himself ever did. But tonight, for just this brief window of time, I allowed myself simply to breathe, unburdened by fear for what felt like the first time in years. The moving boxes sat empty in the corner of the bedroom for 3 full days, before I finally found the strength to fill them, folding Daniel's shirts with careful, mechanical precision, packing away the small collection of belongings that had once represented a shared future, now reduced entirely to cardboard and packing tape. I donated most of it to a shelter downtown, unable to bring myself to simply discard the physical remains of a person, however complicated my feelings toward him had ultimately become. Some things, I had learned, deserved a kind of respect even in their absence. The wedding venue called twice about the deposit before I finally worked up the courage to return their call and cancel everything, explaining in careful, measured tones that the wedding would no longer be taking place, declining to elaborate further when the coordinator asked, with obvious curiosity, what had happened. Some explanations, I had come to understand, belonged only to the people who had actually lived through them. Detective Karen called every few weeks, with updates that grew increasingly sparse as the investigation slowly wound down, the case gradually shifting from active priority to one of many unsolved files gathering dust in some department archive. No body was ever found. No new evidence emerged to point investigators in any particular direction. Daniel simply became one more name, added to the long, quiet list of people who vanished from their lives without explanation, leaving behind only questions that would likely never receive satisfying answers. I attended a support group for a few months, at Karen's gentle suggestion, sitting in a circle of folding chairs alongside other people whose loved ones had disappeared under circumstances ranging from mundane to deeply troubling. I listened to their stories, their grief, their desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, their missing person might still be alive and simply unable to return home. I never shared my own complicated relationship to Daniel's disappearance in those meetings, unable to voice the strange, uncomfortable truth that beneath my carefully performed grief lay a foundation of genuine relief I would never be able to fully explain to anyone in that room. Adrian remained patient throughout those months, exactly as he had promised, offering support without pressure, presence without demand. We continued working together each day, the familiar rhythm of the office providing a strange kind of stability during a period when so much else in my life felt uncertain and unmoored. But something had shifted between us since that evening in his office, when he had finally answered my question honestly. A closeness that extended beyond the careful boundaries of employer and employee, though neither of us rushed to name it directly. My sister, Olivia, visited in early spring, taking a train up from 3 states away after I finally worked up the courage to tell her the truth over the phone, or at least as much of the truth as I felt safe sharing. She arrived at my new apartment with a suitcase and a worried expression that softened only slightly once she stepped inside and saw for herself that I was managing, that the version of me standing before her carried none of the guarded exhaustion she had apparently noticed during our brief phone calls over the previous year. I knew something was wrong, Olivia said, sitting across from me at the small kitchen table, her eyes studying my face with the particular intensity only an older sister could manage. I kept asking, and you kept telling me everything was fine, and I let myself believe you because it was easier than pushing harder. I didn't want you to worry, I admitted. I didn't want anyone to know. I'm your sister, Alina. Worrying about you is literally part of the job description. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and familiar, in a way that reminded me suddenly of childhood, of afternoons spent building blanket forts and whispering secrets long after our parents had insisted we should be asleep. I wish you had told me sooner. I wish I had come sooner, before things got as bad as they apparently did. You couldn't have known, I said. I made sure of that. I was very good at hiding it. Olivia's expression grew serious, her thumb tracing gentle circles over the back of my hand. And this new man, this Adrian, are you certain about him? Because from everything you've told me, and everything you haven't quite told me, I'm getting the sense that he's not exactly the type of person our parents would have picked out for you at a church social. I laughed, the sound surprising me with its genuine warmth. No, I agreed. He's definitely not that. But Olivia, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel safe, completely, entirely safe. He's never once raised his voice at me, never once made me feel small or afraid. Whatever else he is, whatever world he moves through, he has never once been anything but gentle and honest with me. That's not nothing, Olivia said quietly. After everything you went through, that's actually everything. She stayed for the weekend, and I introduced her to Adrian over a quiet dinner at his home, watching carefully as the two most important people in my current life took each other's measure across the table. Adrian, to his credit, made no attempt to soften or disguise who he was, answering Olivia's careful, probing questions with a directness that seemed to earn her grudging respect, even as it clearly unsettled her. "You understand," Olivia said toward the end of the evening, her tone carrying the particular protective firmness she had always reserved for matters involving my well-being, "that if you ever hurt my sister, the kind of world you move through won't matter to me at all. I'll find a way to make you regret it." Adrian met her gaze steadily, something like genuine respect flickering across his features. "I would expect nothing less," he said. "And for what it's worth, Olivia, I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never have reason to follow through on that promise." By the time Olivia boarded her train back home 2 days later, I felt something settle more firmly into place within me, a sense that the pieces of my life, once so carefully fragmented and hidden from the people who loved me, were finally beginning to knit back together into something whole. It was Marco, of all people, who finally pushed the conversation forward, catching me alone near the elevator one afternoon in early spring, nearly 4 months after Daniel's disappearance had first thrown my world into chaos. "He's been different since you came here," Marco said, his voice carrying none of the careful distance he had maintained in the weeks immediately following Daniel's disappearance. "I've worked for Adrian Castellano for almost 8 years, and I've never once seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "Marco, I'm not trying to overstep," he continued, holding up a hand. "I just think someone should tell you, since he certainly won't say it himself. Not until he's absolutely certain you're ready to hear it. That man has built an entire empire on control, on never letting anyone see what he actually feels. You're the only person I've ever seen crack that shell, even a little." I thought about Marco's words for the rest of that day, turning them over in my mind through meetings and phone calls and the ordinary demands of the workday, until finally, as evening settled over the office and the rest of the staff began filtering out toward the elevators, I found myself standing outside Adrian's door instead of heading toward my own commute home. He looked up from his desk when I entered, surprise flickering briefly across his features, before settling into the careful, patient warmth that had become familiar to me over the past several months. "Alina, I thought you'd already left for the day." "I wanted to talk to you," I said, closing the door behind me with a firmness that felt different from every previous time I had entered this particular office. "About us." Adrian set down the papers he had been reviewing, giving me his full attention in the way he always did when something mattered enough to warrant it. "All right," he said simply. "I'm listening." I crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I had once confessed the smallest fragments of truth about my life with Daniel, the same chair where Adrian had first promised that whatever was happening to me would end. So much had changed since that first careful conversation, and yet the fundamental steadiness of this office, of this man, had remained constant throughout every difficult month that followed. "I've spent the last 4 months trying to figure out how I'm supposed to feel about everything that's happened," I began, choosing my words carefully. "About Daniel, about what you did, about what I let happen, or maybe what I wanted to happen, even if I never said it directly. You don't owe me any explanation for your feelings," Adrian said gently. "I know," I said. "But I want to explain them anyway, because I think you deserve to understand exactly what you're getting, if this conversation goes where I think it's going." I took a breath, steadying myself before continuing. "I'm not the same woman who walked into this office 4 months ago, terrified and hiding bruises and lying about staircases. Some part of that woman is gone forever, and I don't know if I should mourn her or thank whatever circumstances led to her disappearing." Adrian remained quiet, allowing me the space to continue without interruption, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've thought a lot about guilt," I continued, "about whether I should feel responsible for what happened to Daniel, whether loving someone, even complicatedly, even imperfectly, means I should carry more grief than I actually feel. And I've come to accept that I don't, Not really. Not the way people expect me to. What I feel instead is gratitude. Complicated, uncomfortable gratitude, but gratitude nonetheless, toward the man who finally saw what I couldn't say out loud, and who acted when I was too afraid and too exhausted to act for myself. Alina, let me finish, I said, and something in my tone made him fall silent again, watching me with an intensity that made my heart beat faster despite the seriousness of the conversation. Marco told me something today, about the way you look at me. He said you've never let anyone see what you actually feel, not in 8 years of working alongside you. I think it's time you let me see it directly, instead of always circling around it with careful, patient distance. A long moment passed before Adrian finally rose from his desk and moved around to stand directly in front of my chair, closer than he had ever positioned himself before. The careful professional boundary that had always existed between us, finally, deliberately dissolving. I've loved you since the day you argued with me about a shipping contract you thought I was handling unfairly, he said quietly, and had the courage to tell me so directly, despite knowing exactly what kind of man I was, and exactly what consequences might follow speaking to me that way. No one had challenged me like that in years. I've watched you every single day since then, and every single day, I've fallen further into something I never expected to feel for anyone. Especially not someone working within my own organization. I felt tears building at the corners of my eyes, though these tears carried none of the exhausted grief that had characterized so many nights over the past year of my life with Daniel. These felt entirely different, warm and full, and unmistakably hopeful. I protect what belongs to me, Alina, Adrian continued, his voice carrying the same quiet, absolute certainty I had witnessed him use in countless business meetings, though now directed entirely towards something far more personal. I have never once regretted what I did to ensure your safety, and I never will. From this moment forward, no one will ever hurt you again, not while I still draw breath to prevent it. That's a dangerous promise to make, I said softly, though I found myself smiling, despite the weight of everything we had both just acknowledged. I've built my entire life on dangerous promises, Adrian said, a rare, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual careful composure. This is simply the first one I've ever made that felt like more of a gift than a burden. He reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and steady, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, I felt no instinct to flinch, no careful calculation about which version of him might emerge in response to my presence, no exhausted vigilance monitoring every shift in his tone or expression. Only steadiness, only safety, only the quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever came next in my life, I would face it, not from a place of fear, but from a place of genuine partnership with someone who had proven, in the most complicated and unconventional way imaginable, exactly how far he was willing to go to protect the people he cared about. We remained in his office, long after the rest of the building had emptied for the evening, talking through everything that had happened over the past 4 months, and everything that might still lie ahead. The careful boundaries between employer and employee finally, completely dissolved into something neither of us felt any need to hide or apologize for. When I finally left the building that night, walking toward the waiting black car that would now, openly, and without pretense, carry me safely wherever I needed to go, I understood clearly that the woman who had once hidden bruises and lied about staircases belonged entirely to the past. The following months brought their own complications, their own adjustments to a life reshaped so dramatically from what I had once imagined my future would look like. I moved out of the apartment Daniel and I had shared, into a new home that Adrian insisted on providing, one with better security, better privacy, better protection from a world that had taught me, through painful experience, exactly how vulnerable ordinary life could leave a person. The staff at the office grew gradually more open in their acknowledgement of the relationship developing between their employer and his secretary, though careful respect always tempered their curiosity, a professional discretion that Adrian's organization seemed to cultivate as thoroughly as any other business skill. I never learned the exact details of what had happened to Daniel that night, and eventually, I stopped needing to know. Some truths, I had come to understand, served no purpose beyond adding unnecessary weight to a peace I had fought hard to finally achieve. What mattered instead was the life unfolding before me now, built on honesty rather than careful deception, on genuine partnership rather than exhausting survival, on a love that protected rather than harmed. Nearly a year after that first morning, when Adrian noticed my careful, hidden limp, I stood beside him at a quiet gathering of his closest associates, wearing a ring he had presented with far less ceremony and far more genuine emotion than Daniel ever had, surrounded by people who understood exactly what kind of world we both moved through, and who accepted without question the complicated, unconventional path that had brought us to this particular moment together. "Any regrets?" Adrian asked quietly, his arms settling comfortably around my shoulders as our small gathering continued around us. I considered the question honestly, thinking back through every difficult month, every complicated emotion, every careful step that had led from that first morning of hidden bruises to this evening of quiet celebration. "None," I said finally, and meant it completely. "I traded one kind of danger for another, Adrian, but this time, the danger belongs entirely to me. This time, I'm the one who decides what happens next." He smiled, pulling me closer, and somewhere in the city beyond the windows of our quiet celebration, life continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the particular, extraordinary journey that had brought two unlikely people together, through circumstances neither of us could have predicted, bound now, not by fear or obligation, but by a genuine, unshakable choice, to build something real together, whatever complicated foundation it might have been built upon.